The air in the MWR tent was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and generator fumes. It was a plywood and canvas cathedral dedicated to forgetting, a temporary reprieve from the coiled tension of the forward operating base. At a small, scarred table in the corner, Gunnery Sergeant Elena Rostova nursed a single glass of whiskey. The amber liquid was her only companion, and she preferred it that way. She wore her uniform with a quiet tidiness that seemed out of place amidst the boisterous sprawl of the younger Marines. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a severe, regulation bun, and the lines around her eyes were etched not by age, but by years of looking at things far away, things most people never saw. To the trio of sergeants holding court at the bar, she was an anomaly, an easy target. They were infantry, fresh from a series of grueling patrols that had yielded nothing but sore feet and frayed nerves. They saw her rank, the crossed rifles of a gunnery sergeant, and superimposed it onto their own world of mud and cordite. They couldn't imagine this quiet, almost placid woman had ever seen what they'd seen. Sergeant Davies, a man whose jaw seemed permanently clenched in a state of aggressive certainty, was the first to speak. His voice a low rumble meant to carry. "Look at that. Gunny from S1. Probably lost her way from the printer." His companions, Corporal Chun and Lance Corporal Miller, chuckled on cue. Chun, ever the sycophant, added, "Probably stressing about a misplaced leave request form." The horror. Miller, the youngest of the three, nicknamed Rook for his newness, kept his laughter muted. He watched the woman. There was something in her stillness that didn't fit their narrative. She didn't react, didn't even seem to hear them. Her focus was entirely on the glass in her hand, which she turned slowly, watching the light fracture through the cheap crystal. Davies, emboldened by her lack of response, sauntered over. He was a bull of a man, built for kicking down doors, and subtlety was not in his toolkit. He loomed over her small table, casting it in shadow. "Evening, Gunny," he began, the title dripping with condescension. "Don't see a lot of admin staff this far forward. Must be a big paperwork emergency." Rostova looked up. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky. They held his gaze without challenge, without fear, without anything at all. It was like being watched by a hawk. "I'm not an admin, Sergeant." Her voice was low and even, with a slight rasp, as if it wasn't used often. Davies smirked, undeterred. "Oh, right. As for then? Logistics? Keeping track of all the beans and bullets? Important work. Keeps the real Marines in the fight." He leaned in, placing his meaty hands on her table. The wood creaked. "See, we're the ones who used those bullets. We're the trigger pullers. The grunts. What exactly is it you do here, Gunny?" The question was a direct challenge, a demand for justification. He was questioning her right to wear the same uniform, to breathe the same recycled air. In his world, respect was earned at the bloody tip of the spear, and he couldn't see a single scar on her that proved she'd ever been near it. Rostova took a slow sip of her whiskey. She placed the glass down with a quiet click that seemed to echo in the sudden lull in the tense noise. Other Marines were watching now, sensing the confrontation. "I do my job, Sergeant," she said, her voice still infuriatingly calm. "You should do yours." The polite dismissal was worse than an insult. It was a judgment. It implied he was failing at his job by wasting time harassing her. Davies' face flushed a deep red. Chun moved to stand behind him, a silent show of support. Miller hung back, an uneasy feeling churning in his gut. "My job," Davies growled, leaning closer, "is to make sure everyone in my platoon is a warrior, that they can handle the pressure, that they're not dead weight. And when I see a senior NCO who looks like she's spent the last 20 years behind a desk, it makes me question the standards." First Sergeant Gutierrez, a man whose face was a roadmap of 3 decades in the Corps, watched from his own table. He knew Davies was a good NCO, aggressive, competent, fiercely protective of his Marines. He also knew he was a hothead. He was about to intervene, to tell Davies to stand down, when Rostova spoke again. "The standards are fine," she said, her gaze unwavering. "Your perception, however, is limited. It was the final straw. Davies straightened up, his fists clenching. You got something to say to me, Gunny? Say it plain. Before Rostova could answer, the entire tent was bathed in a piercing red light. The emergency klaxon blared, a screeching, urgent sound that cut through the tension like a blade. It wasn't the lazy whoop of a drill. It was the high, frantic pulse of a real-world crisis. The MWR tent emptied in a flood of disciplined panic. Chairs were knocked over, drinks abandoned. The Marines moved with a singular purpose, their casual animosity forgotten, replaced by a shared, electric focus. Davies shot Rostova a final, contemptuous look. Time for the real Marines to go to work. He turned and sprinted out into the night. Rostova remained seated for a beat longer. She finished her whiskey in one smooth, deliberate motion, placed the empty glass perfectly in the center of the table, and stood. She walked not towards the barracks or the armory, but directly towards the one place the klaxon called everyone of consequence, the Tactical Operations Center. As she moved through the chaotic swirl of the base, her steps were unhurried, a calm stone in a rushing river of men. The dismissal was complete. Now the crisis had begun. The TOC was a pressurized container of controlled chaos. The air hummed with the drone of servers and the clipped, tense jargon of radio traffic. On the main holographic map table, a sector of the nearby city, a labyrinth of crumbling tenements and narrow alleys known as the Ash Sadiq Quarter, glowed in stark red. Captain Vale, the company commander, stood grim-faced, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. First Sergeant Gutierrez stood beside him, his expression a mask of hardened concern. Rostova entered the TOC with the same quiet deliberation she had shown in the bar. She didn't announce herself, simply moved to the periphery, her eyes scanning the data feeds on the secondary screens. A few operators glanced at her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance. A gunnery sergeant they didn't recognize had no place here during a crisis. "What's the situation?" Gutierrez asked, his voice a low growl that cut through the chatter. Captain Vale pointed to a blinking icon on the map. "Pathfinder is compromised. Staff Sergeant Thorne and Sergeant Diaz. Two-man force recon team on a covert observation post. They were spotting for a high-value target. An enemy sniper team found them. They're pinned down on the roof of the old textile factory. Diaz is hit, leg wound, non-ambulatory. Thorne is holding them off, but he's down to his last 2 mags. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what that meant. The Ash Sadiq Quarter was a hornet's nest, a no-go zone for conventional forces. The streets were too narrow for armored vehicles, and the rooftops provided a perfect killing field for insurgents. "QRF?" Gutierrez asked, though he already knew the answer. "Negative," Vale snapped. "We send a platoon in there and we'll be pulling out bodies for a week. The sniper has the primary approach, Kilo Street, completely locked down. Air support is a no-go. Intel reports active manpads in the area, and the collateral damage risk from a gunship run is unacceptable." It was a classic bloody trap, a small, high-value asset used as bait to lure in a larger rescue force. The options were grim. Leave Thorne and Diaz to their fate, or send more Marines into a meat grinder. Sergeant Davies and his squad, already kitted up, stood by the entrance, awaiting orders. Davies' face was a mask of grim determination. This was his world. "Sir," he said, stepping forward, "give us a route. We'll get to them." Vale looked at Davies, then back at the map. He appreciated the courage, but it was a fool's errand. "And how do you plan to get past a sniper who has every angle zeroed, Sergeant?" Before Davies could offer a brave but futile answer, Rostova's quiet voice cut through the room. "You're looking at the wrong building." All eyes turned to her. She hadn't moved from her spot by the wall, but her presence suddenly filled the space. Captain Vale's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "Gunnery Sergeant Rostova," she said, her tone flat, informational. She stepped forward, towards the holographic map. She didn't look at the captain, but at the glowing red geometry of the city. Intel placed the sniper in the minaret of the Al-Hadid Mosque. That's incorrect, a communications tech scoffed. Ma'am, our thermal sensors picked up a heat signature and muzzle flashes from that position. You picked up his decoy, Rostova stated, not as a theory but as a fact. He's using a suppressed rifle with a heat sink and a secondary, unsuppressed rifle fired by remote to draw your attention. He wants you looking east, towards the mosque. But the fatal funnel isn't Kilo Street. It's the alleyway behind the factory. She pointed a steady finger at a thin, almost invisible line on the map. The shot that hit Sergeant Diaz came from the west, from the third floor of the old Municipal Records building. It's a much more difficult shot, over 900 meters with a complex crosswind coming off the river. But it's the only position that gives him a clear, concealed line of sight to the rooftop access door where Pathfinder is trapped. The confidence in her voice was absolute. She spoke with the chilling certainty of a mathematician explaining an elegant proof. Captain Vale stared at her, then at his intelligence officer, who was frantically typing on his console. Check trajectory analysis based on the wound report. Now, Gutierrez moved closer to Rostova, his eyes boring into her. How do you know that? Sound travels, Rostova said simply. The report from the decoy rifle would echo off the factory wall, arriving a split second before the sonic crack of the actual round from the west. To anyone on that rooftop, it would sound like it was coming from the mosque. It's a classic misdirection. He's patient. And he's very, very good. The intelligence officer's head shot up. Sir, she's right. The ballistic data, once we rerun it with her proposed origin point, is a perfect match. The angle, the entry wound. Holy shit. A stunned silence descended on the TOC. Captain Vale looked from his screen to the unassuming gunnery sergeant. He didn't have time for questions or doubts. 2 of his men were bleeding out. All right, Rostova, Vale said, his voice hard. You've identified the problem. How do you solve it? You can't send a squad, she said. Too much noise, too much motion. He'll spot them a kilometer out. You need a ghost. A single operator or a very small team, moving through the dead zones he can't see. She traced a new path on the map, one that wound through collapsed buildings, sewer access points, and forgotten service tunnels. It was a route that didn't officially exist on any map. And who do you suggest we send on this ghost hunt? Vale challenged. Rostova finally met his eyes. I'll need a spotter and a security element. 3 men. Light kits. We move now, or we'll be recovering tags instead of Marines. Davies, who had listened to the exchange with a growing sense of disbelief and a grudging, newfound fear, stepped forward again. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the cold focus of a professional. My team is ready, sir. His eyes were locked on Rostova. Vale hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. The chain of command and standard operating procedure had failed. It was time for something else. Gutierrez, you heard her. Get her whatever she needs. Rostova, he said, his voice now devoid of any skepticism. You are in charge. Get my men back. Rostova gave a single, sharp nod. She turned to Davies, Chan, and Miller. Armory. 5 minutes. Ditch the heavy plates. We're moving fast and quiet. If you make a sound, you're a liability. She walked out of the TOC, leaving a room full of stunned officers and NCOs in her wake. Davies and his team followed without a word. The mockery from the bar felt like it had happened a lifetime ago. Out in the dark, the real work was about to begin, and the quiet gunny was no longer an object of their scorn. She was their only hope. The air in the armory was cool and smelled of solvent and steel. While Davies, Chan, and Miller swapped their heavy ceramic plates for lighter, more flexible soft armor, Rostova moved to the far end of the room, to a single unremarkable hard case. She opened it with a series of quiet clicks. Inside, nestled in custom-cut foam, was not a standard-issue M4 or an M110 sniper system. It was a rifle that looked like a vicious hybrid of both, a heavily modified State Route 25. Its barrel was fluted and wrapped in a carbon fiber shroud. The stock was a skeletal, adjustable rig, and the scope mounted on top was a piece of optical hardware that looked more at home on a satellite than a rifle. It was a master craftsman's tool, built for a single perfect purpose. She assembled the weapon with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. There were no wasted movements, no fumbled parts. Each piece clicked into place with a quiet, final authority. Miller watched her, his mouth slightly agape. He had never seen anyone handle a weapon with such intimacy. It wasn't just a tool to her. It was an extension of her will. "Suppressors on everything," Rostova said, not looking up from her work. "Standard ammunition is useless for this. Subsonic rounds for entry, match grade for the primary." She slid a magazine loaded with sleek, black-tipped cartridges into her rifle. The sound was a soft, deadly whisper. Davies, humbled and now deeply unnerved, simply nodded. "Yes, Gunny." They moved out into the moonless night, for shadows detaching from the relative safety of the FOB. Rostova took the lead. She didn't use the main gate but led them to a section of the perimeter fence that bordered a fetid canal. With a small pair of cutters, she snipped a barely visible wire, peeled back the chain link, and slipped through. The city swallowed them whole. Her movement was unlike anything they had ever seen. She flowed over the urban landscape, a wraith in digital camouflage. She didn't crunch on gravel. She glided over it. She didn't climb walls. She flowed up them, finding handholds and footholds that seemed invisible. They followed her down into a storm drain, the stench of stagnant water and decay filling their nostrils. For nearly a kilometer, they moved through the subterranean veins of the city, guided only by the faint glow of Rostova's wrist-mounted GPS and her preternatural sense of direction. When they emerged, it was into the courtyard of a bombed-out school. The air was different here, heavy with the smell of dust and old sorrow. "Patrol. 2 men. 20 meters. Northeast." Rostova whispered into her throat mic. Her voice was utterly calm. Davies peered through his night vision goggles. He saw nothing. "Negative, Gunny. I don't see." A soft thump-thump from Rostova's suppressed pistol cut him off. He scanned again and saw them, 2 dark shapes slumping to the ground in a doorway he hadn't even registered. 2 perfect headshots, executed in less than a second, from a moving position, in near-total darkness. Chun let out a shaky breath. "Keep up," Rostova ordered, already moving again. They ascended the school, climbing through shattered floors and over debris-choked stairwells. From the roof, the city was a patchwork of darkness and dim, sodium-orange light. Rostova unslung her rifle and deployed its bipod, her movements fluid and practiced. She laid down on the gritty rooftop, becoming one with the shadows. "Miller," she said, "spotting scope. That building. 3rd floor, 4th window from the left." She pointed towards the municipal records building, a hulking concrete monolith nearly 1,000 meters away. "Look for a distortion, a patch of darkness that's too perfect." Miller, his hands trembling slightly, set up the scope. He dialed in the focus, his heart pounding in his chest. The distance was immense. The wind was gusting, kicking up dust from the rooftops. He scanned the window she had indicated. It was just a black square, like all the others. "I don't see anything, Gunny." "You're looking at the window," Rostova said, her eye pressed to her own powerful optic. "Don't look at it. Look through it. Look at the air. Look for the heat shimmer from his breath, the subtle mirage from the barrel." Miller refocused, trying to understand. He relaxed his eyes, letting the image swim slightly. And then he saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible ripple in the blackness. A faint wobble in the fabric of the night. It was a ghost, an apparition. I see it," he breathed. "God, I see it." "Good," Rostova said. "Davies, Chin. Rooftop security. Watch our backs. Anything that isn't us gets a bullet." The 2 sergeants, now utterly convinced they were in the presence of something far beyond their experience, set up a defensive perimeter without a word. Their previous arrogance had been stripped away, layer by layer, by every silent step, every impossible observation. every display of lethal grace. Rostova began her ritual. She pulled a small, handheld weather station from her pouch and held it up. The device fed data directly to a ballistic computer on her wrist. Wind speed, 15 kilometers per hour, gusting to 20. Direction, 280 degrees. Humidity, barometric pressure. She murmured the numbers to herself, her lips barely moving. "He's behind a barrier," she whispered, more to herself than to Miller. "Shooting through a small hole. A murder hole reduces his exposure." Smart. The world for her narrowed to the circular image in her scope. The tiny ripple in the darkness was her universe. She was no longer a woman on a rooftop. She was a force of nature, a physical law about to be enacted. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate until she could feel the faint beat in her fingertips. Inhale, exhale. The space between heartbeats was an eternity of perfect stillness. That was where the shot lived. "Thorn," she subvocalized into her mic, patching through to the pinned-down recon marine. "Pathfinder 1, this is an unknown element. Do not expose yourself. We are engaging the threat." A burst of static, then a strained voice. "Who is this? We're taking fire." "Stay down," Rostova commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. She made a final, minuscule adjustment to her scope, dialing in the elevation and windage. The numbers on her wrist display told her it was an impossible shot. The wind was too variable. The target was too small, too obscured. The math was a prayer. But she wasn't just a mathematician. She was an artist. "Watch for the gust," she murmured to Miller. "The lull is a lie." She waited. For 10 seconds. For 30. For a full minute. Miller could feel his own muscles cramping from the tension. Davies and Chun scanned their sectors, their rifles held so tight their knuckles were white. The entire mission, the lives of 2 Marines, rested on the stillness of this one woman. Then she exhaled. The rifle didn't roar. It coughed. A single, subdued thump that was swallowed by the night wind. The subsonic round was on its way, a whisper of death arcing across the city. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, through his scope, Miller saw the ripple in the window vanish. A spiderweb of cracks appeared on the glass, originating from a single tiny hole. A beat of silence. Then Thorne's voice, raw with disbelief, crackled over the radio. "Threat. Threat is down. Sniper is down. Jesus Christ. Who are you people?" Rostova was already packing her rifle. "Pathfinder 1, this is Archangel. Prepare for extraction. We are en route to your position." The tension broke. Davies let out a long, shuddering breath. "Gunny, how in the hell?" Rostova stood, slinging the rifle over her shoulder. The moment of supernatural focus was gone, replaced by the sharp, efficient NCO. The math was good. Now we move. The party's just starting. The extraction was a controlled explosion of violence. As they feared, neutralizing the sniper was like kicking a hornet's nest. Insurgent fighters, now aware of the Marines' presence, began to swarm the area. Rostova led the 4-man team through the labyrinthine streets towards the factory, her voice a calm, directing presence in the chaos of radio chatter and gunfire. She didn't just lead, she orchestrated. Chun suppressed that window, second floor. Miller, pop smoke on the left side of the alley. Davies, on me. We're blowing the door. They reached the base of the factory just as Thorne was helping the wounded Diaz down a fire escape. Gunfire erupted from a building across the street, heavy machine gun fire that chewed chunks of concrete from the wall near their heads. Davies instinctively raised his rifle to return fire, but Rostova put a hand on his chest. "Waste of ammo. They're dug in." She unclipped a grenade from her vest. But it wasn't a standard fragmentation grenade. It was a specialized thermobaric charge. "Cover your eyes," she said calmly. She pulled the pin, let the spoon fly, and threw the grenade with a perfect, smooth arc. It sailed through a second-story window of the enemy position. There was a dull thump, followed by a sudden, violent overpressure wave that sucked the air from their lungs. The machine gun fell silent. Thorn, the rescued staff sergeant, stared at her, his face pale in the flickering light of a nearby fire. "Who the hell are you, Gunny?" "Just a ride home," Rostova said, already scanning the next street. "Can Diaz walk?" "Negative," Thorn grunted, adjusting his grip on his wounded comrade. "All right," Rostova said. "Davies, you and I have Diaz. Thorn, Chen, Miller, you're on overwatch. We leapfrog back to the exfil point, one block at a time. No heroes." For the next hour, she directed the fighting withdrawal with the cold, precise brilliance of a grandmaster playing chess. She saw angles no one else saw, anticipated enemy movements before they happened, and placed her team in positions of maximum advantage. She saved Miller's life when an RPG team popped up on a rooftop, putting a single round from her rifle through the gunner's chest before he could fire. She guided Davies' fire, calling out targets with unnerving accuracy. She was everywhere at once. A commander, a rifleman, a medic, a ghost. The 4 Marines, who hours earlier had seen her as a paper pusher, now moved as extensions of her will. They trusted her implicitly, their survival bound to her every quiet command. By the time they reached the designated exfil point, a collapsed highway overpass on the edge of the quarter, they were nearly out of ammunition and running on fumes. A V-22 Osprey descended in a whirlwind of dust and rotor wash, its ramp dropping to receive them. As they scrambled aboard, dragging the wounded Diaz with them, Captain Vale's voice came over the radio, patched through to the aircraft. "Archangel, this is command. Status report." Rostova, leaning against the bulkhead of the vibrating aircraft, keyed her mic. "Command, Archangel. Package is secure. All personnel accounted for. We are coming home." The debriefing room was cold, the air scrubbed clean by the industrial-grade HVAC system. Captain Vale and First Sergeant Gutierrez stood at one end of the table. Rostova, Davies, Chen, and Miller stood at the other. The 2 rescued recon Marines, Thorn and the now stabilized Diaz, sat in chairs along the wall. Vale had the entire mission recording playing on the main screen, a composite of helmet cams and drone footage. He watched the impossible shot. He watched the thermobaric grenade. He watched the flawless fighting retreat. He let the final clip play out, then silenced the feed. He looked at Rostova, and for the first time he seemed to be truly seeing her. The quiet Gunny was gone. In her place stood a weapon, honed and perfected by decades of unseen conflict. "Gunnery Sergeant Rostova," Vale began, his voice formal, heavy with respect. "Your report was concise, but it fails to explain how you knew the sniper's exact location, how you planned an infiltration route through uncharted territory, and how you single-handedly dismantled a prepared enemy ambush." Rostova stood at a relaxed parade rest. "Experience, sir, and a decent understanding of geometry." Gutierrez stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Staff Sergeant Thorn. "Staff Sergeant, you've been in the recon community for over a decade. You've seen your share of firefights. What did you see tonight?" Thorn, a hard man not given to hyperbole, took a long moment to answer. He didn't look at the captain or the first sergeant. He looked directly at Rostova. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated awe. He stood up, wincing slightly from his own minor shrapnel wounds, and walked towards her. He stopped a foot in front of her and came to the position of attention. "Sir," Thorn said, his voice thick with emotion, "for 10 years, I've heard stories. Stories from Fallujah, from Ramadi, from places that don't have names. Stories about a ghost who worked alone or with a small team. Someone who could go into the worst parts of a city and tear the heart out of the insurgency. An urban sniper so deadly, the enemy started believing she was a demon, a jinn. They had a name for her." He paused, and the room became so quiet they could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Davies, Chun, and Miller held their breath. They felt a cold dread creeping up their spines, the chilling premonition of a truth they were not ready for. "They called her Al-Harith," Thorn continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It means the plowman, because wherever she went, She carved a furrow through the enemy ranks, leaving nothing but broken men and shattered morale. She didn't just kill them, she deconstructed them. We had our own name for her. A call sign. Thorne took a deep breath. I never thought I'd see her in the field. I thought the stories were just legends to scare new lieutenants. But there's no mistaking that work. Sir, what I saw tonight, that was the work of Hero. The call sign dropped into the sterile room like a live grenade. Hero. Davies felt the blood drain from his face. His legs felt weak. He looked at Chen, whose eyes were wide with horror. He looked at Miller, who looked like he was going to be sick. The name echoed with a mythology they all knew. Hero wasn't just a sniper. She was a legend, a boogeyman the enemy told stories about, the architect of a dozen impossible victories. A name spoken in hushed, reverent tones in armories and ready rooms across the Corps. And they had mocked her. They had called her a desk jockey. Davies felt a wave of shame so profound it was physically painful. First Sergeant Gutierrez closed his eyes. He remembered the reports, the classified after-action reviews he'd been partially read into years ago. A special projects gunnery sergeant, attached to task force operations. Her name had been redacted, but the call sign was always there. Hero. The one they sent in when a situation was foobar, fouled up beyond all repair. He opened his eyes and looked at Rostova, the quiet woman in the corner of the bar. The logistics gunny. He had underestimated her just as much as his sergeants had. Rostova gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod to Thorne. Glad you're safe, Staff Sergeant. That was all she said. There was no acknowledgement of the legend, no confirmation of the name. There didn't need to be. The truth was now branded on the soul of every person in that room. Captain Vale stared at her, speechless. He finally cleared his throat. Dismissed, he said, his voice hoarse. 2 nights later, the MWR tent was subdued. The usual boisterous energy was gone, replaced by a quieter, more somber mood. The story of the Pathfinder rescue had spread through the base like wildfire. The official version was that a QRF had saved them, but the grunts knew better. They knew a ghost had walked among them. Davies, Chan, and Miller sat at their usual table, nursing their beers in silence. They hadn't spoken a word about that night, but it hung between them, a heavy, unspoken weight. Then the tent's canvas flap opened, and Gunnery Sergeant Rostova walked in. A hush fell over the room. Every conversation stopped. Every head turned. She moved with the same quiet grace, seemingly oblivious to the attention. She went to the bar, ordered her single glass of whiskey, and walked towards her corner table. As she passed their table, Davies stood up. It was an awkward, jerky movement. Chun and Miller looked at him, startled. Davies' face was pale, his expression tight with a turmoil of shame and respect. He held a bottle in his hand, not the cheap rail liquor, but a dusty, top-shelf, 20-year-old single malt he must have traded a month's pay for at the clandestine camp market. He stepped into her path, blocking her way. Rostova stopped and looked at him, her pale eyes as unreadable as ever. Davies didn't speak. He couldn't find the words, the apology, the gratitude, the sheer terror of his own foolishness. It was all lodged in his throat. Instead, he simply placed the expensive bottle of whiskey on the small table in the corner where she always Saturday. He held her gaze for a beat, then gave a short, sharp nod. It wasn't the casual nod of a peer. It was the deferential nod of a subordinate to a master, a student to a sensei. It was an apology, a thank you, and a promise of unending respect, all conveyed in one silent gesture. He then turned and walked back to his table, his shoulders slumped, as if a great weight had been lifted. He sat down and stared into his beer, his part in the drama complete. Rostova watched him go. She then looked at the bottle, then at the rest of the silent, watching bar. She gave a minuscule, almost invisible nod of her own, an acknowledgement of the gesture. She sat down at her table, poured a small measure from the new bottle into her glass, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The silent, symbolic moment of respect was complete. The sun had not yet breached the horizon, but the eastern sky was beginning to bleed from black to a deep, bruised purple. At the far edge of the FOB, overlooking the vast, sleeping desert, Rostova sat on an empty ammo can. Laid out before her on a clean canvas mat were the disassembled components of her rifle. The bolt, the firing pin, the trigger assembly, each piece was a familiar friend. She worked in the pre-dawn chill, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision. With a soft cloth and a bottle of solvent, she meticulously cleaned every groove, every surface, wiping away the carbon fouling and the fine grit of the city. The rhythmic scrape of the cleaning rod down the barrel was a form of meditation, a ritual of purification. This was her church. This was her prayer. The respect in the bar, the fear in Davy's eyes, the legend of the call sign, none of it mattered out here. Those were ghosts, echoes of actions past. This was the only thing that was real, the tool, the craft, and the responsibility that came with it. The cold, hard steel in her hands was an unforgiving truth. It demanded perfection, and she gave it willingly. A soft crunch of gravel announced an arrival. She didn't look up, already knowing who it was. Lance Corporal Miller, the Rook, stood a few feet away, shifting his weight nervously. He held a steaming mug in his hands. He stood there for a full minute in silence, watching her work. He saw the way her fingers, surprisingly delicate, handled the deadly components with a practiced reverence. He finally cleared his throat. "Gunny," he said, his voice quiet, "I brought you some coffee." Rostova paused her work and looked up. She took the offered mug. The warmth seeped into her cold fingers. She took a sip. It was black and bitter, just the way she liked it. "Thank you, Lance Corporal." Miller nodded, but he didn't leave. He seemed to be wrestling with a question, the same question that had been haunting him since the debriefing. "How?" He finally blurted out, the word escaping in a rush. "In the TOC. And on the roof. How did you know?" "All of it. It was like you could see things that weren't there." Rostova looked back down at her rifle, picking up the bolt carrier group and wiping it down with the cloth. She considered the question, not as a challenge, but as a genuine inquiry from a young Marine trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become much larger and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. She ran her thumb over the smooth, oiled metal. "When most people look at a problem," she began, her voice low and even, like the desert wind, "they focus on the threat, the sniper in the window, the machine gun in the building. They stare at it so hard, it's all they can see." She paused, setting the bolt down and picking up the firing pin, holding the tiny, crucial piece of steel up to the dawning light. "That's a mistake," she continued. "You don't learn anything from looking at the target. The target is just the end of the equation. You have to look at everything else. The space around the target." She gestured out towards the dark, sleeping city. "You look at the shadows, the way the wind moves dust down an alley, the way sound bounces off one building and is absorbed by another. You listen to the silence between the gunshots. That's where the truth is. The patterns, the habits, the fears. The enemy tells you everything you need to know, not with what he does, but with what he is trying to hide. He hides in the noise. You have to find him in the quiet." She placed the firing pin back on the mat. "The rest," she concluded, her eyes meeting his, "is just math. Simple, honest math." Miller stared at her, absorbing the lesson. It was a philosophy that went far beyond marksmanship. It was a way of seeing the world. He understood now that her skill wasn't magic. It was a product of immense discipline, unblinking observation, and a lifetime spent studying the quiet spaces where others saw nothing. Rostova turned her full attention back to her rifle. She began to reassemble it, each part clicking into place with a sound that was both precise and final. The sun finally broke the horizon, spilling golden light across the desert and glinting off the oiled steel in her hands. Miller stood and watched until the rifle was whole again, a perfect instrument of lethal purpose. He didn't say another word. He simply placed his own mug of coffee down on the ammo can beside hers, a silent offering. He gave her a slow, respectful nod, turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her weapon and the sunrise. Rostova watched him go, then picked up the second mug. The coffee was still hot. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her chest, and looked out at the new day. The work was done. The weapon was clean, and the silence was once again her own.